So yes, our first session of the main conference explores the challenges of how we continue to retain our operational edge over our current and potential adversaries, and as an inherent element of this, just how we can collectively achieve really effective integration in employing our military capabilities across multiple domains. For this session, I'm pleased to welcome onto the stage Air Marshal Sir Gerry Mayhew. Thank you very much for being with us, Deputy Commander Operations.
Thank you, Susannah. Honoured guests, it's great to be with you, and first panel really looking at operational integration and the journey towards it. Of course, the strategic context, as the Chief has just adequately for us all put into context for us here, is a rapidly evolving and a global phenomenon. NATO, for us in the Euro-Atlantic region, is clearly visible, but we absolutely recognise that our challenge here in this part of the world is mirrored elsewhere with similar threats and similar opportunities. The Royal Air Force has emerged from over 3 decades of campaigning in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, and we are deeply immersed in coalitions that have created lasting partnerships. We have learned to operate together and to some extent interoperate. But the experiences of the last few years have demanded something different of us, and we have returned to something much more expeditionary and agile with our ops and exercises with you as our friends. And the Royal Air Force has started to drive that path of greater interoperability with you and the journey of integration. We've needed to concentrate on doing this within and across all of the domains. And if we really mean multi-domain integration, we need to get past the buzzwords and the acronyms and really start the conversation about how we achieve multi-domain integration with our colleagues in the space and cyber domains and reimagine the air, land, and air maritime seams for the 21st century. Each of us will take a subtly different approach to integration, dependent upon whether your Air Force is a global power, a regional, an expeditionary force, or a force that is deeply embedded in the local area. And to integrate, therefore, we will need a shared understanding of our threats. We must be threat-driven. That will require a shared view of how, where, and with whom we will fight. And with that baseline, we can effectively collaborate for dynamic force design, something which perhaps has been missing in recent years across our services. Our processes and our people must be open to greater interoperability and integration. And with so many of us moving towards agile combat employment or dynamic force employment, those responsible for integration and interoperability will need a new culture that accepts greater risk. We need to be ready to plug and play much more than we are now. We need flexibility to react to the unexpected on policy, plans, tactics, as well as command and control. And there is much for our CAP development teams, our capability teams, to do as much as there is as for the operational teams. Capability and acquisition is a constant review item, but we must bring them into the 21st century for greater integration. COVID has also taught us so many lessons about the whole force concept. So whilst multi-domain is the target, multi-culture must also be understood and is a construct we must bridge across for greater integration. Similarly, command and control across government departments brings freedoms and boundaries for integration that we must also understand more. Capacities are different in those departments. Cultures, security protocols, IT systems, and much more needs greater thought from us all as military. Operations on or near NATO's eastern flank will and has caused us to change our thinking. Long-standing alliances will need reshaping, and we welcome much of our NATO colleagues' work in that regard. We need to do more with NATO now to drive that interoperability and integration phase after the first phase of the operation we are involved in the Euro-Atlantic region. Individual nations have different approaches. They will have different equipment, pace, and outcomes across political, military, and diplomatic arenas. And therefore, there is a difficult perennial question for us to answer: whose standards set the norms for integration across different geographical context? Similarly, a sixth generation to fourth generation gap sits in front of us if we are not careful, and that paradigm needs greater thought and debate as ambitions and costs vary across our nations. There are thankfully some great examples of interoperability, and there's some strong leadership across the globe to drive that journey towards greater integration. We in the Royal Air Force pride ourselves on being a day one, night one capability service, and our partnerships with so many of you as our friends gives us much more of the sum of the parts with high-end capabilities. Examples for us include Typhoon, Poseidon, A400 Atlas, the F-35 Lightning, the transition between Reaper and Protector, E-7 Wedgetail, CH-47, a wide range of weapons and space and cyber capabilities. They are all shared, and they demand greater interoperability and the road to integration at pace. So my four fellow speakers will explore those operational challenges and opportunities. Suraya Marshall will think about our people and what it means for them in this changing context through the lens of her command of No. 2 Group within the Royal Air Force. Justin Bronk will test our thought on Combat Air's operational edge and our partnerships and what it means in the current operational context. OJ Sanchez will give us a perspective about that fourth, fifth, and potentially sixth generation and beyond, and what that means from an industrial perspective, never mind a military. And then Dr. Bowen will take us beyond those buzzwords of space to discuss what are the needs of space operations and the multi-domain challenge and the priorities that they bring. Suraya.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and it gives me great pleasure to be here to talk to you today. So 2 Group is one of the Air Force's group responsible for delivering our operational and warfighting capabilities. It comprises around 14,000 people and is made up of 4 forces: the Air Mobility Force, the Support Force, the Battle Space Management Force, and the Force Protection Force. So in essence, the critical enablers of much of air and space power. So when we look at the operational edge and how we retain our relevance and our integration, yes, we need the right equipment, we need interoperability, we need good tactics and doctrine, and cutting-edge technology, and we'll hear about some of those from my fellow panelists. But people are the key to unlocking their full potential. I'll deal with it in 2 parts: operational relevance and credibility first of all. There are many factors when you look at it through the lens of people and mindset that impact on that. And I'm distilling it down to sort of 3 key imperatives. Firstly, to generate agile, well-prepared forces who are physically and mentally fit to fight. So we can deploy them anywhere and expect them to execute the full spectrum of tasks, including dealing with the unexpected. Now, within 2 Group, Operation Pitting was a great example of that. The evacuation of 15,000 people from Kabul in just 2 weeks last August. On the ground, it was chaotic, it was complex, and it was a rapidly deteriorating environment. But the Air Mobility Force, the Support Force, and the Force Protection Force deployed and worked together to great effect. Yes, platforms and equipment were absolutely essential, but it was the highly trained and highly motivated people that were game-changing. Many of them very young officers and aviators only recently out of training. None of them trained for that specific set of scenario and set of circumstances, but all of them able to use skill, initiative, and determination to adapt to the pretty extreme situation and deliver operational success. And this plays to my second imperative, which is getting the basics right and building on them through continuous development. We must all invest heavily in continuous professional development and use that as the vehicle to grow ethos, fighting spirit, leadership, and resilience from the first to the last day of somebody's service. We must provide our people with that broad range of skills and understanding, as well as the confidence to think, to act, and if required, to challenge. We need to recruit people with those innate skills and then work really hard to develop them further. Over the past few years, our officer training, our senior non-commissioned officer training, and our through career command leadership and management training have been completely redesigned with the aim of creating capable and empowered leaders at every level of the organisation so that they are better prepared for the increasingly complex world that we find ourselves in. And my third imperative is the need to adapt an innovative mindset at all levels. Innovation keeps us at the leading edge by developing our people, our processes, and of course our capabilities at a faster rate than our adversaries. Now, from a people perspective, Astra is the Royal Air Force's journey to deliver the next generation Air Force, unlocking our ability to think differently and to challenge the status quo. And only if we succeed in this will we be able to remain relevant and credible. Again, this mindset needs to start from day one, from the first day of training onwards. People need to be encouraged to be proactive and to take initiative. We need to create a safe environment for experimentation. And for that, we need to be comfortable too with failure, because these are the conditions that encourage innovation to flourish. Now, over the next few days, you'll have the opportunity to speak to a number of Royal Air Force personnel, and they will give you plenty of examples, I'm sure, of Astra sprints and initiatives that are going on across the Air Force. And I take this opportunity to invite you to have a look at the force protection experimentation stands that are set up around the IET, which is the Force Protection Force using innovation to great effect, seeking to find novel solutions to future challenges, and using their recent deployment to Royal Air Force Akrotiri as a proving ground for future ISR and multi-domain integration. But when I look at all those three imperatives together, I think probably a good example of it working incredibly well is Raven, which is the digital backbone that has been created by members of 90 Signals Unit that is now deployed on operations. Designed by a team of 3 technicians, combining technical brilliance, determination, innovation, and commitment to continuous improvement, motivated by their personal frustration, by their own experience of in-service equipment and the length of time it was going to take to get the next generation equipment in, from both a user and a technician perspective. They designed the system from scratch, and of course they were empowered to do so. And they designed it along 3 principles. First of all, start with policy. When it comes to security accreditation, if you don't think about policy until the end, you will never get it through that valley of death. Secondly, focus on the user. What does the user need right now to complete the mission at hand? And thirdly, develop in contact. Do not wait for the 100% solution. Start with 60 and design it iteratively. And Raven has now been successfully deployed to a number of locations in record time at a fraction of the cost of a normal IT system. So moving on now to effective integration. We need to work at this really hard. And I'm, again, going to talk about 3 factors that help us achieve it. First of all, it's integration as a mindset across all domains. I think we are trained pretty well as specialists in air power and increasingly air and space power. But we must proactively expand our mindset to encompass all domains, land, sea, and particularly cyber. An example of this is from Operation Biloxi, which is going on pretty much now, which is the UK's NATO air policing contribution in Romania. It was identified there that there was a significant cyber threat to our people, to our systems, and to our platforms. And so the Cyber and Information Operations Centre got together the intelligence and technical specialists and developed a comprehensive cyber threat intelligence picture. Involved in this was also the Royal Air Force's Cyber Reserves, who bring with them a deep and pretty unique industry and wider government perspective that we simply cannot grow within the service. And with that intelligence picture, they developed a defensive cyber operations plan, which covered technical threats and human behaviour, so the full spectrum. Everything from how we secure our deployed comms to the management of social media. And importantly, that defensive cyber plan was fully integrated into the rest of the air component. And so it did achieve the aim of securing freedom of action in cyberspace to enable the air policing mission. The second factor is that integration requires a total national enterprise approach. The ability to engage effectively with the public sector, the private sector, industry partners, and academia. Within 2 Group, we have a number of different models of how we do that, and of course, there is no one-size-fits-all. Our newest platform, Envoy, is perhaps a good example of this. So Envoy is our command, support, and air transport aircraft. And we did adopt a novel approach. We got it into service in less than 6 months, enabled by using predominantly civilian expertise, both crew and ground crew, becoming more gradually sort of military as we get to FOC in the next 2 years. In other words, harnessing industry's expertise immediately while generating time to build our own, but not compromising on capability delivery. And finally, the third factor is allied by design. Partnerships are vital to our strength, sharing capabilities, lessons, and best practice, and improving our collective understanding and helping us to integrate more effectively. The Royal Air Force is actively pursuing agile combat employment, and this is the key to being more resilient and effective in a highly contested operating environment, not just with NATO or the Joint Expeditionary Force or in Europe indeed, but with all of our partners, because we may be required to operate and collaborate from multiple dispersed locations worldwide at a moment's notice. So yes, we have increased our collaboration or contribution to collective security in Eastern Europe recently, but we've also retained our effort elsewhere. And a good example of this is with our short-term training teams in the Force Protection Force conducting capacity building in places like Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Pakistan.
Okay, don't throw those stones at me. We're going to aim over here. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and to all the air chiefs and air and space leaders and experts. Thank you for your leadership in helping keep all of us safe. And as a lifetime airman and a fighter pilot, I think I heard, it's an honor to be here as a mission partner on the other side and the industry element of this. And so today I'd like to walk through a little bit of connecting what we talked about this morning in technology and where it's going with the operational challenges that you all face every day in this complex environment. So if we could, let's see if I can get this to work. All of us have looked through OB1s consistently through our careers, and they're challenging to understand how we're going to get there. What I would offer is our new CEO, Jim Takelet, after talking with many of you and looking at the threat through your lens and then coming back and assessing our operational analysis and the broad spectrum of capabilities that industry has, realized, I think the word mindset was an accurate way to describe what we needed to change. We needed to start thinking in a different way. And so he set out for us to look through the lens of 21st century security, where instead of seeing the problem just through a platform-centric or through a slice of the battle space, we see it across the whole spectrum in a very complex, mission-driven focus area as we've described before. The challenge of that at the same time of modernizing is not an or proposition, it's an and. So how do we execute in this environment at the same time as we modernize so that we can continue to advance in the complex threats that we described? The platform side, or the physical elements that we described, certainly Lockheed Martin, along with other industry partners that are here, have long been physical experts at integration and bringing forward capabilities, whether those be advanced aircraft, like we'll see, or technologies that will yet to advance, advancing hypersonics, space-based sensors. All those will continue and need to advance to address this threat. But at the same time, we need to move the digital enablement of those assets, as we described this morning, faster into the operational space to be able to tackle this problem. Those enablements are going to need the capabilities such as 5G, underpinned by AI, like we discussed this morning, at a faster pace, and then being able to do distributed network computing out at the edge so that we can do edge processing and continue to advance these longer range kill chains, as was just described, to be able to leverage more of the battle space with more of our assets. To do that, that'll bring us more capability. To do that, though, just like we're in this room, this is inherently a human endeavor. We need one another. And so as we build this architecture of the future, we need to build it with the concept of allies and partners and coalitions from the outset. Long ago, we might have been able to operate in data silos. That's not possible in this battle space. So as we look to build these architectures, we need to increasingly build systems that allow the trust factor so that individual nations feel comfortable sharing their data and their advancements so we can crowdsource out in the battle space just like we see in our everyday, as well as bring advances in technology faster to the battle space. That takes intentionality, but that capability of the physical plus the digital plus the networked effect that we get from our allies and partners is where we'll build this capability to deter and ultimately defeat if we need to in the future battle space. To do that, one of the things that we're seeing at Lockheed Martin, just like you have described throughout, is the absolute need to get to common standards. So open system architectures are required in order for us all to be able to play in a space where we can bring these technologies at a faster pace. There are other technologies that us in the traditional defense sector are not employing as quickly as the commercial side. So we also see almost a responsibility from the industry side to bring forward as almost a bridge for some of the non-traditional defense partners to come forward with their technologies. 5G, AI, these are not new concepts, but they've not been applied in this space. The creators of those capabilities and the ones executing at the fastest pace, they're not used to working in this space with us. They're not mission focused in the way that you all are. We all owe it to each other to help them get into this space so that we can enable this future faster. And that's a responsibility that we think in industry we have to help to bring non-traditional towards this battle space and find a way that they can help us move forward. And then lastly, how do you do it? If you look at an OV1 like this, like we all have, if we tried to solve this all at once, we'll be talking about this same OV1 in another 10 years. And I think we all know that. So we've described oftentimes that we need to take an incremental or a crawl, walk, run. I have flipped that around in the way I talk inside with our team to we need to run, walk, crawl. And I say that intentionally because in many cases, what we need to do is start closing kill chain loops at individual nodes to mission effect. And when we find a space that we can close a kill node and we can be more effective, even if it's not the whole battle space, we need to run at that, get it operational, and put it in the hands of the warfighter. There are other spaces where we need to walk or maybe even crawl to make sure we put the right architecture in place that'll actually scale. But we need to have a mindset and an attitude that helps us to drive to those outcomes much faster to operational impact. So move beyond demos and run towards execution-focused approaches. So with that, as we think about that inside our own, I come from the Aeronautics side of our corporation, we think about that. We've gone through our own metamorphosis, much like has been described. If you asked a decade ago, we were probably primarily a platform-based company. We thought about how do we do the best integration on platform. We did that well, as did many other companies. We've now learned that we have to move forward into thinking about the whole Airpower solution. So from design, develop, produce, sustain, we'd like all future things to be digitally born. And if you think about the agile combat employment that was described, you have to build that in from the beginning, and it probably won't come in the form of traditional requirements. We need to think about how to enable systems before it's asked for. So in an Airpower solutions approach, we're looking to leverage the end outcome across all systems, one platform at a time, but with a common thread across. And that's hard. It's hard for all of us individually in our own nations. It's hard inside of companies, and it's hard when we collaborate. But it's the approach that we need to take in order to get there. I give one personal example. I had the privilege of being one of the first Air Force operational pilots to fly the F-22 in the early 2000s. Stepping into that airplane was remarkable. The difference it made after a long career in fourth gen immediately in effectiveness was tremendous. However, by design, that airplane and that system was mostly a closed-loop system. It took in information, and then it shared it amongst its flight and its peers, and then dominated the airspace. That's the opposite of what we need to design for the future. Counter that with, say, the F-35 today, and you think about across the airspace, air and space domains and cyber domains, there are many examples where we can connect and use these platforms as nodes. Just recently, and I know I saw General Wilsbach here, just recently out in Indo-PACOM, we watched an exercise where an F-35, in this case just a node, an advanced sensor communicator, was able to take data on a target, pass it through an open system gateway, different language, translate, provide to a high-end shooter, in this case a Patriot missile on a small island in Palau, to engage a target at ranges that weren't previously capable. That's advanced in capability. We need to run after solutions like that. So when we think about integration in Airpower solutions, instead of just being outside-in integration, we need to be both inside out and outside in, and do that faster. And so that's how we're thinking about how to help enable this. And fundamentally, what do you do first? It really does start at the intersection of where does the operational analysis, your all's mission needs, intersect with where the technology is today. And that's what we're trying to do. That does take a partnership and collaboration, just like we've described. So treating your industry teammates as teammates will be a faster way to get there. And we hope to be good partners in that across all of the defense industry and all our nations. And those are the conversations you see across the board, is how can we enable this mission set? So the time's now to be able to do that. We've now gone from a couple of digital pictures to actual real pictures. So from big to small, if you think about that security vision going all the way down into actual platforms, we can't disregard the reality that we are a platform-centric air and space force. If you start on the bottom, I described how we designed the F-22. Well, how do you move on from that? Well, if you think about what we're doing now in the U.S. Air Force Modernization Program, we've now re-architected that F-22 to an open system architecture, and it's being installed, actually the first on a fighter aircraft at that scale. So now as we modernize that platform with advanced technologies to allow it to get further out, be able to sense, shoot, and kill, it'll now be able to take in that information and share it more broadly with the joint enterprise. That's how you can go backwards in time to pull a platform forward. At the other end of that, and again, I'm looking at this snow now as we all sweat. We might all want to be in Alaska by this weekend, but at the top end of that, we have the F-16, and again, this is a community very familiar. The F-16 is ubiquitous. There's still over 3,000 flying today. There's 700 in Europe. We have the 4,600th coming off the line in our new factory. So we think about that. We can't disregard the fact that these systems are out there in mass, and we want to enable that mass. As one example of doing that, when you see the two top airplanes, we're modernizing the radar on the new Block 70, Block 72, as is the U.S. Air Force. It's over 70% common in hardware with the F-35, over 95% common in software. That'll enable a faster modernization pathway and leveraging the capabilities that are coming through the 5th gen platform into the next, back into the 4th gen. So we need to keep thinking about that as we go. And then lastly, the F-35 in the middle has become a catalyst in many ways for some of this nodal thinking. The next step in that is how do we bring technologies from the next gen backwards? And this morning you heard Mark Cole talk a bit about distributed operations or distributed teaming. This is an example of where maybe the F-35, it's not an immediate opportunity to put in the battle space, but in a short number of years, we could see pulling teaming assets of crewed and uncrewed into an environment where from very low-end expendables, potentially up to higher end, we're able to expand capability into that network using that nodal effect off of the F-35. So that's what we're working towards, I think, collectively, and certainly on our side at the Lockheed Martin team to go forward. And then as we think about going forward into the next generation, we all know that there are some unique systems that have to be developed for the high end. We must continue to press forward with next generation capabilities. The last of that is got to be digitally born. And so everything we're doing in that digital space, we see immediate impact, and we'll look forward to bringing those systems forward. So thank you again for your time and your service for those of you in uniform, and I appreciate any questions you might have.
Right, I guess I'll be different and go for this podium. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. Thanks to the Air and Space Power Association. I'll try to keep this short. I've got 10 minutes, but as my students at Leicester know, when I talk about space politics and space warfare, I tend to go on quite a bit and can talk quite extensively about them. So I've just got a few points today, and I will try to keep them very, very brief. I'll try to give a general space perspective on what we've been hearing so far. The trend really that we're seeing in space on a global level is that only more and more militaries are becoming more dependent on space systems as time goes on. What the United States did in 1991 really showed everyone what the potential was back then with very experimental systems, which 30 years or so later now is quite mainstream and things that we can't really live without. What we've been hearing about long-range precision fires are supported, of course, by space systems, and the longer range and more precise you want to be, and the more dispersed your forces want to be, the more you will then become reliant on space systems. And for any of you who are watching Russian and Chinese military modernization, you'll know that space plays a very important role in that modernization for all manner of military tasks. But importantly, and especially for countries perhaps in the middle ranks of space power, such as the UK, other European countries, but also countries like South Korea, Japan, arguably India as well, that they can't really aspire to do the same kinds of things that especially the United States has done in the past, simply because of the sheer expense and cost of doing space. Regardless of the promises of companies like SpaceX, space is still a very expensive and capital-intensive thing to do. So countries that are in the middle range, that are now maybe getting into space or maybe thinking about expanding existing military space systems, they have to make difficult choices, what we were just hearing earlier about focusing on perhaps a major military threat in Europe. There are very difficult choices that have to be made with space in many ways because it is very, very expensive for more modestly sized militaries to do. Even Russia arguably can't aspire to do what the United States or China does, simply because China and the United States has far more money, capital, and human resources to spend on space. So Russian space power arguably is more orientated towards air and land capabilities, whereas China and America are more multi-domain, all-domain rather. Then for America's allies, and it's interesting to note that between the United States, NATO, the European Union, and other allies, notably Japan, Australia, and South Korea, that is the lion's share of the world's capabilities in space and space economy, however you define it. So there is a lot of potential there that is already being tapped into on an allied basis for integrated operations and for modernizing smaller terrestrial military forces by plugging into larger US and increasingly European military-grade space capabilities. So there's a lot of potential there for integration, but as we have already heard, more military forces are formalizing their space capabilities and space institutions and bureaucracy as well, not least here in the UK with a new Director of Space role and also UK Space Command. But there are difficult questions in terms of what exact capabilities are required, and they have to flow from what the overall terrestrial military priority is. There's no point in investing in space systems just for the heck of it. We have to make them relevant to the major priorities on the ground on Earth. Space warfare is just a continuation of Terran politics by other means, is what Clausewitz, I'm sure, would say if he was alive today and saw what was going on in space. So it is irrelevant if it doesn't contribute to what you are doing on the ground. So clear terrestrial priorities are needed to make the most impactful investments in space capabilities, and they will be competing with other possible investments with especially smaller militaries. But as we know, even in the United States, they can't fund absolutely everything that is on any military's wish list. But the problem is particularly acute for smaller militaries. But there's a lot to learn from the past here as well. Space is often seen as something that is new and exciting or emergent, but a lot of the technologies we're talking about have been proven concepts for longer than I've been alive, actually. So a lot of these technologies are now just mature or more advanced versions of what was pioneered by the Soviets or the Americans in the 70s and the 80s. So there are critical questions in terms of what makes a difference in operations and combat capabilities in terms of, do smaller militaries, smaller relative to the Americans and the Chinese, do they want to have space capabilities that are new, that might do something different to what existing systems do? Do you want more of proven systems to increase the bandwidth, so you increase communications bandwidth, or you increase the availability of space-based ISR for operations? As we know, militaries are very data-hungry organizations, and when something big happens, everyone is scrambling to call everyone or want all the images and information available on what goes on. So is it just about having more of the same? Or is it about building more sovereign options or things that are just more operationally responsive to that military or to that government at hand? So these are difficult questions, and we are seeing that now being talked about in a lot of non-US NATO militaries, but also in countries like India, Japan, South Korea, and also Australia. So there are very difficult operational questions being made. And what they are dealing with is not just the proliferation of space power in that sense, where space is becoming more accessible to smaller militaries, both as consumers on the ground, or even perhaps having more modestly sized constellations in space on their own, but also dealing with the prospects of space warfare itself. So it's important that when we talk about space warfare and counter-space operations, whether that's kinetic anti-satellite missiles or electronic warfare or jamming or computer network operations, attacks or cyber warfare, it's important that we first approach space first and foremost as an enabling infrastructure for everything a modern military force and the wider economy wants to do on the ground. And space warfare is about attacking that infrastructure to start undermining all the capabilities and activities that we've heard about so far in this session and earlier today. So those smaller militaries, as they become more dependent on space systems, are just making space more of a target-rich environment for potential adversaries, creating the incentives for attacking space systems. Now, just because things can be done in space doesn't mean it should be done in space either. So a mix of capabilities are usually good, but as we know, long-range precision fires and imposing dispersal on the enemy, especially over extremely long continent-scale distances or hemispheric distances, can only really be supported by space systems. So there's an increasing risk that smaller militaries are having to deal with greater hostile actions in space for the space systems that have now become dependent on for the past 30 years, especially NATO countries relying on the United States for military support. So I think it's an interesting time ahead for military modernization for many countries, not just the United States and China, but looking at India, Japan, and South Korea in particular, where they have large military forces on the ground, but are also developing significant space capabilities and technical infrastructures that they can rely on themselves, especially India and Japan. So South Korea itself is getting more into space at the moment, and they are increasingly interested in long-range precision fires for their military threats as well. So I guess I will leave that there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, for rounding up those presentations. So we've had a few questions which have come in, and I'd just like to put the first one to, I think, let's put it to Justin. Justin, you threw a few stones, and I want to ask you a question now. So what do you think global air forces need to do to stop giving them headroom to gain the operational edge? And that's from Phil at Wavell Room.
So clearly, beyond a certain point, this is something that is a political decision rather than an Air Force decision because it comes down to mission focus. I think, however, there could usefully be a more honest discussion between senior Air Force leaders in most countries, frankly, with their political decision makers to say, no, we actually can't keep doing everything while having and put on our mission requirements. Actually, we don't have the capability to do this anymore. And if you want us, for example, to invest in making what is currently a relatively hollow capability to enable a sovereign mission set that you want, if you want us to do that, we either have to stop doing large chunks of things, so for example, cutting back significantly in strategic mobility or fixed-wing ISR, which is only survivable in permissive or at best semi-permissive airspace. In the UK's case, the UK has a very, very large mobility fleet and a relatively large ISR fleet for its size in terms of budget and total number of aircraft and squadrons, compared to most air forces of a similar scale. That is a policy choice. It was a policy choice that was made to support 20 years of enduring operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan. The question would be, if I were holding the pen, heaven forbid, if the question is, can we act as a reliable framework nation as a key air power provider to NATO in Eastern Europe, then the answer would be, I'm going to have to start doing a lot less of that stuff, except that nations that perhaps have less permissions for doing pointy things in other people's airspace might step up on that, particularly with some of the defense funding that's been announced. and let other nations which have the appetite for that pointy stuff and some of the building blocks really invest in those penetrating capabilities.
If I could get
high end.
Sir Gerry the chance to respond.
What was the question again?
And I suppose really, if we focused in on perhaps, are you seeing any change? And what Justin highlighted was this absence of cooperation for simulation, this kind of closed loop that so many nations have. There's not enough sharing of information. Are you seeing progress being made in that area? Do you think we're going to see a real push imminently?
Very much so. And Justin's themes are absolutely right. There's a reflection of 30 years of some of those challenges being in place. But I am now seeing real progress being made. The amount of effort that is going in linking 30 miles apart, never mind 3,000 plus miles apart with the US colleagues on synthetics, for instance, is a real opportunity for us in this year and next to get after making sure that our collaborative training is done in a different way. We no longer have the freedoms to fight in our 5th and 6th generation platforms in the future in the way that we've trained before. So we've got to do this, and leadership in this room, I know, is driving that behavior with industry. So I am seeing a lot of interoperability challenges being knocked down, largely because we are sharing the same things. Now, there might be gaps in some of the capabilities because of 30 years of doing something different, but those are now being reimagined for the 21st century, not just the things that were 1970s and 80s. Mm-hmm. That's very tempting to go, well, we've done that before, particularly from the likes of us that were there in the end of the 80s, early 90s. It's not being done that way. It's being reimagined, and new capabilities are being put in place to do some of this gap coverage.
Okay, thank you. So, Suraya, Marshall, could you take this next question? As innovation accelerates and industry provides potential solutions to developing threats, how best should global air forces match this technology with human performance? I mean, you've talked about really setting in process initiatives within the Royal Air Force to really grasp innovation. How can this be expanded and you can really see it matching human performance?
So, I mean, a really fascinating question, and you know, it's about, I suppose, setting the conditions for all of those initiatives and innovation to be maximised. There is a significant piece of work in going on in the Royal Air Force at the moment that looks at exactly that, human performance. So it's not just about the machine and the equipment, it's about how do we optimise us. So looking at people as the sort of capability, and hopefully that will be, I mean, it's being rolled out in some of the sort of ground troop domains at the moment, but actually it's relevant to everything that we do, because actually you can get so much more out of the human. And of course, as the equipment and the data and the technology gets much more complex, you know, how do we optimize ourselves to be able to maximize use of it? I think it's a really, really key point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me bring in Orlando, because there's a question that I think you might be able to take. Is true multi-domain integration an unrealistic aspiration, either as single states or coalitions?
I don't think it's an unrealistic aspiration. I think the opportunity to do it all at once is unrealistic. The opportunity to advance towards levels that are useful and effective exists today. And how far we need to go is also not yet determined. So I think we sometimes see it as a 1 or a 0. We are either all integrated across all domains with ubiquitous information flow, or we're not. And I don't think that's where we will land in the future. We need to continue to move that way, and we may find, like was described, that in some areas, whether because of technology limitations or platform or existing structures, we don't go as far as we would like, and in others we may go farther than we thought. In the end, we need to measure that goalpost against the mission sets that have to be performed and be demanding to get where there's a mission gap, demand that we get there in that MDI space, up until the point that it's not possible. So I don't think it's an unrealistic aspiration.
Okay. Do you think it's unrealistic?
No, and I think we've been doing it for a very long time as air and space power professionals. I think we're probably leading in interoperability, and the conversation about how to do things better together has been out there for a very long time. I think there's perhaps a mistake of you've got to be doing MDI every second of the day. You don't. It might be months that you do an MDI plan, or it might be years that you do an MDI plan, but to be able to do it better is the journey we're on. But we are multi-domain by nature as air and space professionals, I believe.
Let me bring in, thank you for that, let me bring in Bleddyn Bowen again. I'd just like to just hone in a little on what you were talking about. Do you think one of the lessons of Ukraine is that there might be kind of a renewed attempt, given, for example, the reliance on satellite imagery, to push the conflict into space?
So I don't think there's anything new from Ukraine in that regard. Commercial space imagery has gotten a lot of attention for obvious reasons, because it was on everyone's Twitter feeds, and that sort of directness of it was new to many individuals, but in principle it's not new. Commercial space imagery has been used for military purposes for, again, longer than I've been alive. So in principle that's not new, and as soon as militaries and governments started using space for, well, first off for nuclear warfighting purposes and nuclear intelligence gathering from the late 1950s into the 60s, the motive for attacking space systems was already there. So what you're seeing now are just more and more potential reasons for doing it. The method of attack would vary, of course, with large constellations of small satellites, but there's nothing in principle new from what we're seeing from Ukraine, and we've seen shutter controls being used as well, by virtue of we didn't really get any updates on Ukrainian movements before the invasion. Everyone was just seeing what commercial satellites were picking up from the Russians, and even then, probably not everything. Yeah, thank you.
Could I just chip in? Well, one thing which has been interesting, though, in terms of the Russians, who have a very high-end ASAT capability, both kinetically and in terms of soft kill or disrupt, is that we've seen quite a bit of disrupt, not much soft kill and no hard kill at all, partly because, A, this is in many ways a classic superpower proxy conflict as far as the Russians are concerned. There is a strong incentive on both sides to keep it contained within area, and space is almost by definition out of area. And also, if you were to go kinetic in space, you can't control who that escalation in terms of debris actually hits and denial of service. So very quickly you'd be taking out Indian satellites, Chinese satellites. You know, a Russian ASAT test or launch against a Ukrainian asset is difficult to contain. So there's incentives against it there. And also there's mutual dependence on the same assets. So one of the reasons the Russians haven't been hitting downlink capabilities is because the Russians are relying on the same downlink capabilities provided by commercial providers, and also piggybacking on GPS because GLONASS isn't good enough for some of their targeting. So actually there's a mutual dependence on space that's actually stopped a lot of the kinetic stuff that we feared might be a case in great power clashes.
Thank you. Just one final question for Suraya Marshal. We've talked a lot about culture change. You focused on the culture change taking place within the Royal Air Force. What lessons do you think can be learned to enact culture change to increase this interoperability?
Well, cultural change takes time, I think, by nature, and I think the challenge for us is trying to speed that up. And so it does take, I think, a commitment, from the top down and the bottom up, really, to drive it forward. And we have to succeed. It does take a different mindset. It doesn't come easily to those who are perhaps more experienced and used to doing things in a certain way. So I think we have to challenge ourselves to really embrace that and kind of set the conditions for it to improve.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you to all the panellists. It's been a really fascinating discussion. It's all we have time, though, for during this session, but thank you very much.
Thanks.
Would you like to lead us?